This is my 2024 Book of the Month year in review. Hi, I'm Colleen. If you're new here, I talk about books and writing. Today, we're obviously going to talk about Book of the Month. Apologies, I have a terrible cold. Hopefully my voice doesn't sound too off. I'm very stuffy. It's winter. I used to do this video in the summer because I started my Book of the Month subscription in June or July, I can't remember. So it was easy for the first couple of years to just be like, it's been a year, but now it's too hard for me to remember where I started and ended. So I just do January, which means that I am sometimes sick now and have a red nose. It's fine. Let's talk about Book of the Month. If you're here, you probably know what it is. If you stumbled upon this and have no idea what it is, it's a book subscription service. I joined it, I think in 2021, a while ago, as a way to broaden my reading genre. So I'm a non-practicing librarian, which sounds very odd. I'm a librarian who doesn't currently work as a librarian. I have a past of working at publishing companies and at bookstores, but most recently, I've spent the last almost 12 years of my life raising my 4 children and being a stay-at-home mom / author. And so I haven't had that like constant flow of new titles, new authors that I should be checking out coming into me. And I had gotten stuck in a bit of a fantasy romance rut, I felt like, and I wanted to expand the genres I was reading and decided to join Book of the Month. And I have done just that. Now I read a lot of thrillers, I read historical fiction, contemporary fiction, lit fic, etc. The way Book of the Month works is they pick 5 to 7 titles every month that are the picks for the month, and then they have add-ons that are also books you can get through them. You can only get them if you pick one of the books that are like the special books of the month. They do a pretty good job at varying the genres they offer each month. You're not gonna have a month that's like just the thrillers and romance. They try to offer 5 different genres at least. Sometimes you'll get like 2 thrillers in October, something like that. If this sounds interesting and you wanna check it out, I'll put my coupon code in the description, which allows you to get your first book, I think for $5.99. I have to double check. I will have the right price in the description. I forgot to check before I started filming. Now let's go ahead and just start reviewing my year with Book of the Month. Because this is a data heavy video, I do have my handy dandy laptop here with this nice document I made breaking down everything I read from Book of the Month in a year, which I'm not a huge data person, but I love doing this every year. So I skipped 3 months, but I bought so many books this year. So I got 3 in January, 2 in February, 3 in March, skipped April. Bought 4 in May, 3 in June, skipped July. Bought 4 in August, 2 in September, 4 in October, 2 in November, and skipped December. So even though I skipped 3 months, they used to only let you get 3 books, and now you can get up to 5, I think. And obviously there were a couple months there in which I got 4. And when I look back at the titles that I got those months, one of the months, all 4 of them were probably bad choices. One of the months, I got 4 3 times, not twice. One of the months I defend what I got. And then the last month, I mostly defend what I got that month. Here are some just sweeping generalizations I've noticed this year from Book of the Month. When I was going through this, I kept thinking, wow, this wasn't really like a strong year comparatively. I feel like there were so many of the other years, I read these books that were just amazing and blew me away. And then I realized it's because I do get quite a bit of backlist when I'm ordering, but not as much anymore because I've kind of gotten most of the backlist I was excited about. So, in previous years, I'm getting like Circe. I'm getting The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I'm getting The Broken Girls by Simone St. James. Books that are like really popular or authors I really love. And so those were mixed in, even though those books didn't come out when I was even a member of Book of the Month. And so they were kind of like pulling my rankings up. So I'm trying to keep that in mind as I look at my rankings this year and not be overly critical. But I will say this is the first time since starting Book of the Month that I did not read a book this month that was like an instant favorite. And I had some books like last year, I read The Frozen River, which was not an old book. It was a new book. And that was like an instant favorite. I love that book so much. I recommend it constantly. And it's by Ariel Lawhon, in case you're wondering. But I was just thinking about how I didn't really have a book like that this year that I felt like I'm still recommending months later. There were a lot of books that I really enjoyed, but it just wasn't the same. Let's start talking about books. All those numbers are to say I got 27 books total. I will be reviewing 26 because there's one I haven't finished yet, which I'm going to talk about, but obviously not review. And usually I wait until I finished all of the books I got but I don't think I'm going to finish this book until the end of February. And I feel like it's a little bit weird to do a 2024 review 2 months into 2025. So the book I'm not going to finish till the end of February is The Secret History. This is obviously backlist. It's by Donna Tartt. It's every dark academia kid's Bible, I guess. I'm on page 172. I am planning on reading a chunk in January and a chunk in February to finish it. I don't think this is going to be one of those backlists that I'm like, oh my God, this book was so good. If it is, I'll probably put it on my 2025 review since it didn't technically get into the 2024 one. But right now I'm feeling like middle of the road about it. I'm not feeling obsessed. So yeah, now let's start with the rankings, and we're going to go low to high, of course, because who starts with their favorite and ends with their least favorite? I DNF'd one book. So the one that I did not finish was Honey by Isabel Banta. It was a June pick. And honestly, June was one of those months that I should have skipped because I didn't want any of the main books, but I wanted Swan Song by Ellen Hildebrand specifically to read in June because I really like to read an Ellen Hildebrand in June. So usually I would just put it on my TBR and get it the next month, but I didn't want to wait. Like I really wanted to read it that month. So all the books they had out in June, Honey seemed like the one I would maybe be interested in. I found this book, okay, so for those of you who didn't read it or aren't familiar with it, it's kind of like a fictional telling of pop stars at the time period of Britney Spears, NSYNC, Christina Aguilera, young Jessica Simpson, Backstreet Boys, like that era of pop star. So like that late 90s, early 2000s pop star era. I don't really find the main character either to be, first I was like, oh, she's going to be a Britney Spears, but she didn't feel like a Britney Spears. And then I was like, oh, is she a Christina Aguilera? But she didn't really feel like her either. I did not like the narrator's voice at all. I found it pretty boring and very like unemotional and detached from everything that was happening to her. And I took out the bookmark. I think I read like 150 pages and then I put it down for like weeks. Picked it back up to try to force myself to read it, read 2 more pages and was like, I'm not going to force myself to read it. Also, as you'll see, the May, June, July time, I was reading a lot of book of the month that I was not enjoying. So there are quite a few in this pile that, or actually I guess just 2 other ones out of these bottom 5 that I just wasn't liking. And so I was just like, just don't read it. Just don't read it. So sorry, honey. You weren't for me. My next least favorite book, and it's the least favorite of all that I finished, and it's very disappointing because this author's written 3 books and I really liked the other 2, is The Fury by Alex Michaelides. He wrote The Silent Patient and The Maidens, which I read both those books in like under 48 hours. I really enjoyed them. This one I just did not like at all. It purposely has like a unreliable narrator who's like telling the story almost like in an over-the-top way. It's about an ex-movie star, her different friends, and they're all on this island in Greece and they get cut off from the world and there's a murder. But I just didn't like the voice of it. And it might partially, I read The Silent Patient, I think last fall. I was trying to remember if I maybe read them too close together. The narrator sounded similar to the narrator in The Silent Patient, but like not as good. I'm just stumbling over my words here to say that this was a mystery thriller that I didn't really like. And if you're going to read an Alex Michaelides, read The Silent Patient or The Maidens because they're both very good. Was it so bad that I won't pick up his 4th book? Because I'm sure he's writing a 4th one. No, I really like The Silent Patient and The Maidens. I don't know if I'll buy it though. I got The Maidens from the library and I got The Silent Patient used for like $3. And if he writes a 4th book, I think I might go that route instead because this one was such a letdown. Next is one I finished relatively recently. Shelterwood by Lisa Wingate. This was an add-on, not a pick. And after I bought it, I was kind of like, why did I buy this? So I was trying to read more historical fiction this year. And after I talk about all these, I'll give you my exact genre breakdown as to what I read from every subgenre. And so when I saw this one, I was like, oh, I'll grab it. It's a historical fiction that takes place in Oklahoma. And I wish I had read, I don't think I read the sample pages or anything. And I wish I had read a little bit more, read some reviews, because this was just a really slow paced book. Like it's not a medium paced book. I like fast paced books and I enjoy medium paced books too. I don't like slow paced book. This was a very slow paced book, like barely could read a chapter a day. It was very slow paced. It has 2 different timelines. One is 1909 Oklahoma, one is 1990. 1909, you're following this young girl who, her and her foster sister are escaping like her bad stepfather to kind of go live in the woods without really a plan. In 1990, you've got a woman who's a new park ranger in this made up national park in Oklahoma, and she finds 3 skeletons and trying to figure out who they belong to. The 1990 portions I could get into. Like, they were pretty good. They weren't great, but like they were still very slow paced, but it was like a little bit more of like a crime fiction. And I liked that more. The 1909 parts, I just didn't enjoy at all. So it made this a bit of a harder read for me. A lot of people on Goodreads loved this book. A lot of people love her reading style. I'm just not one of them. Writing style, not reading style. It's already time for the last book that I read for the year. And that was The Ministry of Time by Kayleen Bradley. So The Ministry of Time by Kayleen Bradley, got it in May. It obviously took me until December to actually read it. I started it a couple times and just couldn't really get into it. For me, this book kind of suffered I thought the idea, the premise of it was really cool, but I didn't like the execution. We have an unnamed narrator who is like, she's called a bridge, and she is in charge of basically shadowing and getting a time traveler accustomed to the modern world. And her time traveler is a man from the 1800s who was supposed to freeze to death. They only pick people that were supposed to die so they don't mess with like genetic lines and stuff, I guess. I think what was hard for me is that they have a romance, and I didn't buy it at all. And that's probably because I read so much romance. I started skimming at the end, so the science fiction-y part got a little muddled in my brain also. But, you know, Kayleen Bradley, you're doing great. The New York Times named this one of the best 100 books of the year. Or 50, I can't remember if it's 50 or 100. And then next was another book I got in May. And usually I would think I would totally love this, but it was The Return of Ellie Black by Emiko Jean. Here's why I didn't like this book. One, in the description, it says there's a girl who's been missing and she comes back. And then you have to try and figure out what happened to her. This book has first person what happened to her in the past. Like, you jump into the past, and it was very upsetting to read. Because she's a teenager, and exactly what you think would happen when a teenager is kidnapped by a psychopath man is what's happening to her. And so I don't like reading that like first person assault at all. I mean, you're not supposed to like reading it, obviously, but I get like sick. Like, I don't feel good reading that kind of stuff. And then I really disliked the ending of this book. So that's just more of a personal preference. I have nothing wrong with the writing at all. I think a lot of people who, if first person assault doesn't bother you, you'd probably think that this was a great read, but it just didn't work for me because of that. Now we're moving up. So those were the books I didn't like. Now we're going to move into like, these books were like fine. They were fine. They didn't do anything great for me, but they didn't do anything bad for me. I was a little bit neutral feeling on them. An interesting thing I just noticed, I have 4 books in the fine category, and they were all either add-ons or backlist that I bought. None of these were actually book of the month picks, which is an interesting thing that I found them in, that I find them all in fine. The first is Familia by Lauren E. Rico. This is about a woman who does a like Ancestry 23andMe type test and finds out she's not genetically related to the people who she thought were her biological parents, who are not alive. And she goes to Puerto Rico to try to figure out who her actual family is. This had a lot of like really cool setting description. The reason I have it in fine is there were some plot points and some kind of like really unbelievable things that happened that I thought took away from the story. There's that quote from someone famous, and I can't remember what it is, that says, when you write fiction, the reader needs to believe it could happen. And when you write nonfiction, the reader needs to believe that it couldn't. So like your nonfiction needs to be so unbelievable, but your fiction needs to be believable. This I probably would have liked more if it was nonfiction, because it felt, some of the things that happened just felt really unbelievable. But setting description, beautiful. Liked a lot of the books. It wasn't like a struggle to get through. After that, I've got Middle Tide by Sarah Crouch. Mostly I put this down here because I vaguely remember this book. It's a crime fiction. I got 2 crime fictions this year, which I had never gotten before from Book of the Month. And I would say crime fiction is an interesting genre because it reads almost like a procedural detective show. It's not a thriller, it's not a mystery, but you follow a crime, usually from the point of view of a detective or I think it's a detective in both ones I read. It was fine. I remember reading it fast. It's really short. It's like 270 pages, I think. But it's about a woman who's like a doctor who's found hanging on someone's property. and then you have to follow to see maybe who did it. And it was fine. It was fine. Next, I have Just Another Missing Person by Jillian McAllister. This was an add-on months before I got it. Sometimes if there's like some thrillers as add-ons, I'll put them on my TBR so that if I haven't read a thriller in a while, I'll just grab it as an add-on. So this was one of them. Mostly, I thought the beginning of this book was fine, and the second half of it was so wildly unrealistic that I couldn't suspend belief to really enjoy it. And that's all I can say. It's basically about a girl who goes missing, and the detective gets a note that says, don't solve this crime. This is the person who you're gonna get for this crime, and gives her a person that a man who she has to get convicted for this crime, or we're going to release this, and like blackmails her, which sounded so cool. But again, this is one of those things that I feel like sometimes it doesn't, when you live in a different country. So it takes place in the UK, and like the thing that it's like they're blackmailing her over, I don't think is illegal in the United States. Like, it's not a good thing, but the punishment they talk about, all that, it was hard for me to believe the motivation. And then the way this book ended was wild in not a good way. Lastly, I was really conflicted on where to put this book, because part of this book I loved, but then other parts I was just not into. It's The Great Divide by Christina Enriquez. It's my last book in the fine category, up to the good. It's kind of like sitting on the edge there, because this book has, not exaggerating, 35 narrators. Some narrators you see more than one, some you are with for 2 pages. So there's so many narrators, and it was one of those where I feel like it kind of took away from the book rather than added to it, because there were quite a few narrators who I really wanted to spend a lot of time with. Not the people we get for like 2 pages, but the narrators we get more than once, who I would love like more pages with them. So it's about the building of the Panama Canal and all the different people from all different walks of life who come to Panama because of this. Ada is a 16-year-old from Barbados who's coming there for work because her sister needs an operation. She needs money. I think I would have loved this book if the entire POV was Ada. Her voice was fantastic, but I remember reading hers and was like, oh, I can't wait to follow her. And then we didn't hear from her for 100 pages. And I was like, I want to know what's going on with Ada. So I think that was the hard part for me. Also, this book is a lot of it is about malaria. And while I was reading it, we found out one of our children has a mosquito allergy. And it was it's very hard to deal with a mosquito allergy. It's like it's not like anaphylactic, but just the stuff you have to go through with covering a child in bug spray. And then if they get a bite, everything you have to do immediately. I read this in July or August, I think, and it just was not the right time. I think if I read it right now, because I'm not really thinking about her mosquito allergy right now, I would have enjoyed it a little bit more, because the malaria parts were really hard for me to read. We don't live in an area where there's malaria, but just, the good books. These are books that, liked them. Didn't blow me away, but sure, they're good. The first is Dinner for Vampires, Life on a Cult TV Show by Bethany Joy Lenz. It's a memoir. Look at me getting a piece of nonfiction on this list. Who am I? At the beginning, Bethany Joy Lenz tells everybody that her cult is kind of boring, and it kind of is. I liked One Tree Hill a lot, which is why I picked up this book. And one of my friends who loved One Tree Hill, she only does audiobooks because she's a very long commute, and told me she loved the audio. Bethany Joy Lenz narrated it. So I was like, oh, maybe I'll like it. And it was good. It was fine. It was like, a normal memoir. How I talked about Familia being a little too outlandish to be fiction. This was a little bit boring to be nonfiction. Her cult steals her money. And there's not much else beyond that. But if you like celebrity memoirs, which I don't think I've ever really read one before. I read her co-star's book, Grimoire Girl by Hilary Burton Morgan, and I loved that book, but that is like the memoir of being a witch. Much more my vibe. Now I'm going to start talking about books that I like. That was like the last, I had that in the good, but that was the last one I have like negative stuff to say about. Okay, so next, Sorceress Comes to Call by T. King Fisher. It was fun to read a standalone adult fantasy novel. I hadn't read one of those in a long time. It's a retelling of Goose Girl, which is a Brothers Grimm fairy tale. You've got a girl whose mom is an evil sorceress, and I love an evil witch in a story. Like, not a good witch, she's a bad witch. she's a witch like from a fairy tale. And her mother can kind of control her, and she is trying to get this wealthy man to marry her so they can live off him. She has like a demonic horse also, which was a great part of the book. Our other narrator is the sister of the man the sorceress is trying to marry, and she knows something's going on. And it's very high magic, but high magic with people who don't really know what's going on. Like, you know, they're thrust into this world, and I enjoyed it. It was my first T. Kingfisher. I thought it was a good read. Next, I have my second crime fiction of the year, and it was Northwoods by Amy Peace. This takes place in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. I love the Northwoods of Wisconsin. And so that's the main reason I bought it. It's another one where like it's a procedural. You're following a detective who is struggling with alcohol addiction, and he is trying to figure out who murdered this kid who was in Northwoods for the summer. I liked it. I thought it was a good, solid crime fiction read. You feel like you're watching one of those shows on PBS where it's like a 90-minute episode of a crime show, of a like procedural detective show. I enjoyed it. And then last for this category, I have First Lie Wins by Ashley Elston. I read this for my book club. It was our first book for my new book club, and it's about expensive con artists. So I actually still have the sticker in my book from when we did the book club, so I'll be able to tell you everybody's name. So our main character is Luca/Evie. She switches identities quite often to con people, and she is conning this man who she's engaged to and kind of falling in love with. And then someone who has her real name comes to the town, another con artist, but they've given her Evie's real name, which is Luca. And then something terrible happens to that woman, which has now happened to Luca. And then you follow her from there. And I really enjoyed it. It wasn't the best thriller I ever read, but I enjoyed it. I forgot I had one more in the good section, and I just put a piece of paper down because I made a mistake. I try not to sell any of the books I get from Book of the Month until after January. But I was thinking that I had got this book the year before, because I did get it in I think last January. And it's This Spells Love by Kate Robb, which is a romance, but it's got some witchy feels, but it's not overwhelmingly witchy. Our main character has just had a really bad breakup. She decides to try the spell that's gonna make it so she never met her ex. But she does the spell without realizing that she met her ex the same day she met her best friend, who's a guy. And it messes up her life because as she's in this other timeline, she realizes she's in love with her best friend. I don't love that trope. In general, it's like the movie Family Man. It's like tons of Hallmark movies do that, where you wake up and you're actually married to someone else, or you actually have that job. I don't love that trope. I put this high because I would say, without being very spicy, Kate Robb wrote really good spice scenes that were more sensual, and I thought she did a very good job on those, which is why I put it this high on the list. Now let's get into very good. This is my biggest stack. It's gonna be hard for me to pick up. Heave-ho, oh my word. So very good is where I put books that I recommend to other people. I do sometimes for good as well if I think someone specific will like it, but this is where I start to be like, oh yeah, read this book. So the first one is A Song to Drown Rivers by Anne Liang. This is historical fantasy. You follow Zishi, who is so beautiful, renowned for her beauty, to the point that her country decides to train her to become a courtesan to the neighboring country's king, basically to bring down their kingdom. And she accepts, and she is trained by a man named Fan Li, and they sort of fall in love before she leaves. And then she is in there. She is making this king fall in love with her. She becomes a trusted advisor. The setting of this is so lush and well described, and you just feel like you're there, and it's really beautiful. I read this very fast. This was a book that I flew through. My one critique would be that it has kind of a young adult voice, which Anne Liang, this is her first adult fantasy. I know she normally writes young adult, I think, now that I'm saying that. I don't know if that's actually true. So there were some themes in here that I felt were not explored in an adult manner, more in a young adult manner. But if you like folklore retellings, if you like tragic historical fantasy romance, you probably really like this book. Next, I have House of Glass by Sarah Pekkanen. This is my second Sarah Pekkanen. I read The Golden Couple a couple years ago and enjoyed it. This was a cool book because it's about a family whose nanny has recently either been murdered or accidentally fell out of a third floor window and died. And you find out that the nanny was pregnant with the dad's child when all this happened. Our narrator is the court-appointed psychiatrist, psychologist, lawyer, I can't remember exactly what her title is, who's going to hang out with the family and decide who the child should live with. If the mom, dad, or the grandma is the right caregiver to live with the child. And then she starts trying to figure out who actually committed the crime, because she does not believe that the nanny fell. She doesn't believe it was an accident. And it was good. It was like twisty-turny. I really liked the ending. It was one of those where when you got to it, I didn't expect it, but it made sense. So I liked it. I liked it a lot. Good thriller. After that, we have Hera by Jennifer Saint, which if you watched me review this originally, this book was so interesting because I really like Jennifer Saint's retellings. I really like Greek mythology. Hera is my least favorite Greek goddess. She's like everyone's least favorite goddess. She punishes victims all the time. And I didn't necessarily like how Jennifer Saint changed the persona of Hera. You make Hera a victim very early, and then she's like, trying to fight Zeus from the inside. I didn't love that. But the end of this book is so beautiful. And Jennifer Saint's really good at ending a book because with the exception of Electra, I don't really remember how that one ends. Ariadne and Atalanta both end beautifully. So she is really good at writing the end of a book. And this one, just those last 30 pages were just gorgeous. Chef's kiss. But the rest of the book had some issues. If you're going to read a Jennifer Saint, I wouldn't necessarily start with Hera. I do think reading them in the order in which she published them is probably the best way to go. All right, next up, we have one of the books everybody couldn't stop talking about this year that I actually read. It's The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. This book was good. So it's a lit fic. And I think a lot of people went into it thinking it's a thriller. And you definitely have to go into it with lit fic energy, not with thriller energy, because it's a long read and it's not a fast read. It's about a family who lives on the border of and own this camp. And their teen daughter goes missing. And 15 years earlier or 18 years earlier, something like that, their son went missing. And so you jump time between before their son went missing, when their son went missing, when their daughter was little, you jump time and you follow lots of different people. You have lots of different narrators in this book. The end of this book is really, really sad. It's just, the final image is kind of weird, but the end, when you figure out what happened, is really, really sad. So I will just give you that caveat so you know. Obviously, when you're talking about missing children, it's pretty upsetting. Also, the child that's missing from before, not the teen, is a young child. It's I think a 9-year-old boy. So it's definitely I feel like that's such a different vibe than missing teen. Missing teen, you always hope it's Runaway or something like that, but missing 9-year-old is not Runaway. So it's sad, it's dark, but it's very well written. We're getting there. Thanks for hanging out. This is a long review, but again, when you're reviewing 26 books, it's gonna take a long time, right? Next, I have The Stone Witch of Florence by Anna Rash. I read this very recently, and I really enjoyed it. It's historical fantasy. You're following a woman who's a stone witch, and you jump between two time periods. I have to look up the years so I get them right. Also, can we talk about how beautiful this book is? Because you've got some really pretty maps and illustrations. I really liked it. So you're in 1335 and you're in 1348. And in 1335, Minerva is young. Look how pretty that is. She's young and she's learning to be a stone witch, and she's having an irresponsible relationship with someone she shouldn't. And then in 1348, she has been dispelled from Florence for witchcraft. And in 1348, she is begged to return because there's a horrible plague ravaging the city, and she goes back. And it turned out to be a little bit more medieval mystery than I thought it was going to be. There is a lot of witches helping women in childbirth, doing stone magic, but there's also Minerva and her sidekick solve a mystery, which I wasn't expecting, but didn't not enjoy. Still thought it was very good. Okay, let's keep going. I have The Wild Huntress by Emily Lloyd-Jones. This is a YA retelling of the Mabinogion, which is a Welsh collection of legends, and it's about the wild hunt. You have 3 narrators. Branwen, who is a huntress. She had something happen to her when she was a baby, and now she can see fey monsters, and she hunts them. And then you have Peardery, who's a human prince who was stolen by Fae, raised by a monster, but then returned to the human world. And then you have Gwydion. These names are so hard. And Gwydion is a member of the royal family, but he's not very powerful. The royal family's magical. He's not very powerful, but he is a trickster and he is a spy and he is pretty shifty. And the three of them join the wild hunt trying to win, and then you follow their adventure. And I really enjoyed it. Last book in the very good, then we're going to be in the great, is Swan Song by Ellen Hildebrand. This is her last Nantucket book, maybe. If you read the afterwards, she said she might eventually go back to them, but she needed a break. And I actually read an article that said she couldn't sleep because she was so concerned about whether or not she had anything left to say about Nantucket, which made me kind of sad for her. But it's about the police chief who you've met in all these Nantucket books is going to retire. It's about his last case. And basically there's a personal assistant who goes missing during a houseboat party. And at the same time, the people having the party, their extremely expensive mansion burns down. And then you jump back in time of him. So you're watching him solve the case, but then you're going back in time through the assistant, what the summer was like working for them. And it's very rich people behaving badly. Ellen Hildebrand does that very well. Let's talk about the great books. So I have 5 books in my great category, starting with Daughter of Mine by Megan Miranda. I really enjoyed this thriller. So our narrator is Hazel, and her father has just died and bequeathed his house just to her, which is very odd because Hazel's not his biological daughter. He and her mother dated. Her mother abandoned her, but he has 2 biological sons who are both on the police force, and she doesn't live in their town, but she returns. It takes place in North Carolina. Her brothers are both kind of upset about this. What happens is at the same time, the town is going through a horrible drought, and this lake, Mirror Lake in their town, is slowly evaporating, and they're finding a lot of bad stuff, like cars from car accidents, missing people. And so a lot of stuff is being unearthed at the same time. And Hazel has to figure out why her father gave her the house and what actually happened to her mother. It was really good. Next is a book that I cried almost the entire time reading it, and it's Shark Heart, a love story by Emily Habeck. It's under Litfic, but it's magical realism / fantasy also. It's about a world in which sometimes you have a genetic mutation that makes you slowly turn into a wild animal. And for me, I read this as an allegory for dementia and Alzheimer's. So if you have anyone in your life suffering from that, know that will probably be very heart-wrenching to read, because our narrator is a woman. Well, there's several narrators, but one of them is a woman whose husband is slowly turning into a great white shark. And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. I'm going to cry thinking about it. It's so sad because she's just watching this person she loves slowly become an animal she'll never get to be around again. So that's a big part of it, is that some people's loved ones turn into animals that it's not bad. They can keep them in their houses and they can keep them around, but some become so violent and so dangerous that you can't have them anymore and they can't live there anymore. And it's so sad. It's so sad. But it's so beautiful. But it's so sad. Okay, we're at my top 3. Number 3 is the best thriller I read all year, and it's Listen for the Lie by Amy Tintera. I just made my sister and my brother-in-law read it, and they both loved it so much. Immediately, my brother-in-law finished it and said, that was amazing. What's the next book I should read? And I'm like, it was the best one I read all year. I don't know what to tell you. So this is about a woman who everyone in her town thinks she killed her best friend. She can't remember what happened. She just wandered out of the woods with a horrible traumatic brain injury, carrying a stick covered in blood, and her friend's body's in the woods. And she doesn't know what happened. She doesn't know if they got attacked. She doesn't know if they got in a fight. She has no idea what happened, but she knows that it was her best friend, and she loved that best friend. So it's been 10 years, and this man decides he's going to do a podcast about it, and she's like, great, because she doesn't live there anymore. But she goes home, and she meets him, and then being home starts to stir her memories a little bit. One of my favorite things about this is they juxtapose what people are saying about her best friend on the podcast. She's just the sweetest girl you've ever met. Everybody loved her. She lit up a room, all that. And she's telling you about what her actual best friend was like, which she wasn't the sweetest person you've ever met. She was kind of abrasive, but she really was loyal to her, and they were good friends, and she gave her good advice, like, get away from that guy. He's not good for you. And so I really liked that, because whenever you listen to a true crime podcast, I don't listen to many, but I do listen to National Park After Dark, and you get that, sweetest person they've ever met. was that person really like that? Or is it like that whole, like, well, you don't speak ill of the dead? The end of this book was so good. I really hope it gets adapted into a movie or a miniseries because I would eat that up. The second best book of the month book I read this year was The Fox Wife by Yang Zi Chu. This is high fantasy. It's so beautiful. This is about foxes as Chinese mythology sees them, so as shapeshifters. And you follow this woman who is a fox shapeshifter through hundreds of years. I don't think we're quite at thousands. I think we're at hundreds of years. And she is hell-bent on finding the person who killed her child, who was a fox. And it was so good. And then you also have a detective who's kind of like following her, but her narration was so good. And this book ended so beautifully. I also read The Ghost Bride by Yang Zi Chu and adored it. I haven't read Night Tiger, her other book, but I've heard it's fantastic. So I probably should read that. This was really beautiful. If you like historical fantasy, because this is historical fantasy, it's, let me just tell you exactly what year it is, 1908, where the majority of the story takes place, because you do jump around a little bit. If you like historical fantasy, if you love setting, I'm such a sucker for a good setting. If you like foxes and mythology, which I think is very cool. If you like kind of a heartbreaking love story, but it's not the forefront of the story, so be aware of that. It's just really, really beautiful. Really beautiful. And then lastly, this is kind of hilarious because I read this book such a long time ago. And I had a hard time deciding of the top three which was going to be my favorite, because I really loved Listen for the Lie. I really loved The Fox Wife. But this is the only book that I was like obsessed with. I couldn't stop thinking about. It just kind of like had my heart in a chokehold, and that was Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross, which is the sequel to Divine Rivals and the conclusion of that story. I don't want to tell you too much about this book because it's spoilers for Divine Rivals, but it's basically about a setting in which two gods are at war and humans are fighting the battle. It's YA, it's fantasy, but you get a real World War I feel. The warfare, the feel of the cities and the towns and even the clothing they wear feels very World War I. There are magical typewriters. There are kind of these star-crossed lovers who keep getting torn apart due to circumstances. I read this book like so nervous the whole time because I loved all these characters so much that I felt like ill over what was going to happen to them. And I feel like that's what makes a best book, right? When you feel actually ill over what might happen to these fictional characters. I also don't usually really like YA. Loved this book. What can I say? Oh my gosh, you made it. It's going to take me forever to edit this video. So really quickly, before you leave, here's a little more data. My genre breakdown. I read 7 mysteries or thrillers, 3 historical fantasy, 3 contemporary fiction, 2 fantasy, 2 crime fiction, 2 historical fiction, 2 lit fic, 2 young adult, 1 science fiction, 1 romance, and 1 memoir. I disliked / DNF'd 5. I thought 4 were fine. I thought 5 were good. 7 were very good, and 5 were great. Overall, what a great reading year. Oh my word. If this video made you want to belong to Book of the Month, please check out the link in the description. And if you belong to Book of the Month, did you have like a top, whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books you can quickly put in a comment and let me know? Did you feel like I also love, like, was Honey your favorite book of the year? And did you think Ruthless Vows was terrible? I love that because being a librarian, I'm a big believer that like every book has an audience. You're just not always the right audience for it. So in the comments, if you want to tell me anything about your year with Book of the Month, or if you're interested in it, please do. If you made it to the end of the video and you don't want to write words, give me like 3 big stack of books emojis, because good God, look at this mess I have to clean up. Oh my word. All right, here's to happy reading in 2025 and hopefully a great year of Book of the Month reads. I got 3 in January. I hope you're in the middle of a good book, about to start reading a good book, or about to start writing a great book. I'll see you soon.